Let's get everything set up here. There we go. Add some trees and greenery. So I'm gonna apologize if the video might be a little grainy. I'm just doing this today off of my MacBook, but and I'm a little hoarse as well um, from talking all day. So the topic that I want to get into, which you can see by the thumbnail, is that you have existing property owners now that are next to developments. They have issues with the development next door. Whether it be flooding, whether it be drainage, whether it be you know noise pollution one side or the other, disrupting farm operations in that particular example, you know, whatever the scenario is, a lot of times you can almost guarantee it's going to be the same outcome. Now, here in Florida, we have several different avenues that you have to go through to try and initiate and regulate a change. One of those being at the local level, which is county. A lot of depends on who you talk to. The people that I talk to, county level, usually are really good. They're really knowledgeable. You have SwiftMud, which is Southwest Florida Water Management District. I deal with them quite a lot. They're okay for what they are. I'm not going to say they're the greatest by any means, which we'll get into that. You also have the Department of Environmental Protection here in Florida. They only do certain things. They're very limited in what they do, and that's fine. With that being said, though, the idea of it all is supposed to be, you know, each each person takes a piece of the pie, and they regulate different things in order to make sure that the rules are being followed. Sounds great in theory. With that being said, that's not what happens. And so, what actually happens is precondition, which would be no development, it's just farmland or whatever that's there. Um, there's usually they might have some light, moderate flooding. By some cases, it might be extreme, and then post development being there, depending on what practices they use for fill, how it was fill, how the land was cut prior to um, the fill being added, what kind of dirt they use. There's so many different things that go into it. Now, the biggest thing is everything can look great on paper. But what comes down to the fact is what looks good on paper may not look good in implementation. So what we're actually seeing on some of these sites may not actually be what was drafted on paper. The some of the other issues that we see are these individuals that are drafting the calculations and then fact checking those calculations in some of these government organizations. They don't exactly know, what or how they've got these calculations in a lot of cases. Some of these are theoretical, some of these are assumptions, some of these are unfortunately just a best educated guess. Now, with that being said, am I really going to trust my life, my property, and everything else, um, based off of a best educated guess. That's kind of what we're doing right now. It's not working out so well. So the reason why I brought this up was because of a conversation that I had today, and the fact of the matter is, this is what I can prove. Pre-condition, we didn't have any impacts. Post-condition, there's impacts. Not just to me, but to another neighbor as well. And when you actually get down into the nitty gritty of what SwiftMutt does, what they don't do, they really don't do a lot. They're more of just a box checker. And to make sure that, they're accounting for all the stuff like they say they are, and this and that, and it's more or less just a box to check and move on. Now, they're giving these permits, to alter things, but they don't actually know how they're getting these calculations. They don't actually do any of the research into the area. Again, it's more of an administrative approval thing, and the problem with that is, in this particular case, and I actually did not come up with this. A neighbor of mine that we've been dealing with all this stuff. We were talking earlier, so I want to credit her with this. Um, Although it does make a lot of sense, and I've actually done uh, this process before when I worked for site development. They take what they call paying. And that's very common here. If they need a little bit of fill dirt when they're digging the retention ponds, they'll take and they'll do, like a 60-40 split, 40% pan, 60% new material, kind of mix it together into like a really good clay substance, and they'll slap that down as fill dirt after they do the scrapings. What ends up happening though is that dirt becomes so saturated with water, and the green element and everything else, which is all your vegetation and stuff that was on top, and in through the layers, that it will actually ooze and seep the water out for a long period of time. That also leads to the water table in that area elevating itself because the ground's so saturated and it can't get rid of the water. It just cannot permeate through that barrier. Now, the other thing that also causes is it causes the ponds that they dug to substantially elevate in level. And that's what we're seeing on site. We're seeing that the ponds, they guesstimated were supposed to be at, let's say 13 feet. Well, now, they're at 15.5. Okay, that's 2.5 feet above the seasonal high water line. That's a huge thing. That's a big issue. And that all goes back to what they calculated on site, what matters and what supposedly doesn't matter. And in this particular project, they did a LiDAR scan before they did anything. I believe it was after they knocked the house down, or at least that wasn't included in the data that I've seen. And with that being said, anything from what we found out that is 6 inches or less is deemed not valuable to the calculation. Now, the problem with that is that these LiDAR, they can be accurate. Obviously, it's laser emitted, but if there's thick vegetation, if there's shrubs or weeds, things like that, as in the property's not maintained or it's not mowed close to the ground, they're not going to get an accurate picture of what is actually represented on site. And then the other problem that you have with that is, well, this might give you a general representation of how a site is sloped or graded, but until you actually set boots on the ground and you start, dabbing that GPS surveyor out there, you ultimately do not have concrete evidence of what your site is, what is actually going on the surface level of the site. The other thing is that in the ground, that has a certain capacity. That's from what the conversation I had is somewhat. Um, it is somewhat considered and not considered at the same time. So that's another huge element. Because again, going back to that pan fill element, you've essentially created a hydrophobic layer of dirt that will not permeate. Plus, it's super compact, which is also another reason why it oozes the water out for so long of period. Because it just takes so long to get through all the layers. And the the thing about it is the other challenge that we have here, because there's so many of them and I think people don't realize it, is there's wetlands everywhere here. Wetlands are absolutely vital to the not only like the aquifer and the drinking water and like all of that, but it's absolutely vital to these areas that rely on them for flood reduction, to just ultimately absorb stormwater. When it rains, the local uh, flora and fauna of vegetation and animal species and all these things that coincide inside of that little ecosystem. When you go messing with that stuff, it not only affects that area, but it also affects the areas that surround it. It affects the whole watershed, and one watershed plays off another ultimately. It really is not, you're only messing with this one, you're messing with every single one in the area. And Florida's water table is so high to begin with. Making it any higher creates a lot more issues. The other thing that I'd like to say in regards to that is there is absolutely no concrete proof or evidence that what these engineers put on paper is actually what's being represented on site. Now, as-built is different. As-built is actually taking, GPS samples and actually shooting grade on those around the site, and it's putting those on paper and saying, okay, this is what we brought the grade up to, and this is how essentially this meets the standard. But if you don't have concrete evidence with what you started with, then you have no way to prove your results, and there's nobody going and checking up on this. There's no instrumentation to prove that these calculations are correct, and all these things, to do with stormwater ponds or anything else, they're all dependent on humans. They're all dependent on maintenance. They're all dependent on weather conditions. They're all dependent on what data they were modeled after, how old that data was. There's a lot of complex things that play into this situation. And ultimately, the homeowners that surround these developments are seeing the impacts of how these things play together. The other side of the coin is you've got these developments that are honestly just doing some shady shit. They really are. And the reason why I say that is because on this site we have a company here that, once they built, well, they put a bunch of stuff in conservation / wetlands. They planted a bunch of plants in there, and they've ran irrigation to some of them to try and keep them alive, but they're in a wetland. So why do you need to do that? And then now that we have these issues that we cannot correlate to any of the things we've already talked about, supposedly, um, the knee-jerk reaction a lot of times is, well, we're going to have to modify the wetland. The wetland was fine before you got here. It functioned properly before you got here. Nobody complained about it. Now you've had all these modifications and adaptations and all this other junk, put in, all this other stuff added around here, all that good stuff, and now you're having an issue. Well, if it wasn't there before and it's there now, it's got to be something that you've changed. And a lot of Florida wetlands are what are called low quality or degraded quality wetlands. So they're a low functioning. They could be brought up to a high functioning standard. Not that all are or all serve that purpose, but most could, with the right amount of treatment and therapy and things like that. It's highly possible. But, one problem arose because of another. And then once you treat that problem, well, it pushes it somewhere else. And usually, in the case of water, it pushes it somewhere else downstream. The other thing that a lot of people do not realize with these developments is that these developments, when they are in the design phase, they have to appropriately, um, you know, assess what the runoff of the property is. So that way, when they do their calculations, those are correct. And not only is that important, but, what way it goes, how it spread out, as it goes, that sort of thing, at what speed, at what volume, what duration of time is it, run out over. All of these things are super important, or you get the results that we're talking about. And the reason why I bring that up, is because, again, if it wasn't there before, it's there now. It's caused by a result of what you did, not the wetland itself. And that also needs to take into account those calculations, all the stuff downstream. On a Swiftmud level, they don't care about anything that the county mandates. The county cares, obviously, right? Or they wouldn't mandate it. But the Swiftmud level, they're just looking for state compliance. Federal level, they're just looking for federal compliance, all that good stuff, right? So the county here mandates that 50% of what the precondition, so before the development was there, whatever runoff, they have to cut it in half after the development's built. So, if they got to build so big of a storage pond times how many ever, then that's what they got to do in order to collect, hold, and slowly release that water. um, if not, then they get fined if they find out that they're not following that standard. But the problem with that is there's no instrumentation there to tell them that. There's nobody going there to check them. There's nobody there running the numbers to say, yep, this development's putting out so much more CFM than what it was before, and that's in violation. So unless we as citizens are active and we're looking into this stuff, we're being nosy, and we're taking the time to do our due diligence and learn all the ins and outs of this issue, we're going to continue to have these problems. Because there's absolutely nobody else checking on this stuff. I can understand somebody saying, well, what's it any of your business? Why are you being the nosy neighbor? Well, if it directly impacts our way of life, and I'll give you an example on this project because it's a really good example. Beforehand, this was part of what they call a historic creek, okay, on this project. And essentially what that means in this case is it did have water flowing through it at one period of time, like a continuous stream flow, but it does not currently. It was a creek bed. It is not currently. It is dried up. With that being said, obviously during large events, I mean, all that stuff kind of rehydrates. It picks that water back up, helps vein that water in the right direction, um, which is positive during those big events because you need stuff like that, especially if the infrastructure in an area is still very rural and doesn't have a lot of maintenance. Every little bit of help you can take is the better. But the fact for us is a lot of us, our properties were built 20 plus years ago. Our infrastructure was built for at the time, and that means, as time has progressed, things have gotten worse, flows have gotten higher. What was, say a 16-inch culvert, from side to side, the diameter, or excuse me, the diameter of the pipe, could be mandated a 20, could be 25 inches now. Well, the old properties are not mandated to come up to the new code, and if they've been functioning fine, why should they update, right? Everything's been fine. They haven't, seen a need to update their infrastructure. It's kind of a win-win, right? Everybody else is kind of doing their thing, making sure their piece of the pie is good, and we're making sure ours is. But you have to account, well, if I'm putting out a fire hose strength, that might over inundate the downstream neighbor that has an undersized pipe. So I've got to account for that and release my water accordingly, so that way the water flows through as efficient as possible, but it doesn't overdo everything. And that is supposed to be taken into account, but if they're not able to verify what they're actually putting out versus what they're putting out theoretically on paper, this is what you get. You get a bunch of theoreticals and possibilities and, well, it should work, and this and that, and this is what we should be putting out. What are you actually? And there's nobody going through, and there's nobody checking this. This is a huge issue. SwiftMud, the Department of Environmental Protection, and honestly, the Florida Fish and Wildlife, they're a huge conservation effort. Every single one of them need to be gutted from the inside out and completely redesigned because they are not doing what they should be doing. There is absolutely no enforcement action, and if there is, it's very limited, especially with SwiftMud. Talking to the inspectors and the different people that I talk to, essentially it's a whole circus show of what they have to do in order to get the administrative approval to, you know, enforce, a fine or a remedy or anything like that. Sometimes, and even if it is a fine, sometimes it's just easier to just pay it and keep going. I mean, we've seen that here in this county many, many, many times. It's sad that it comes down to this reality, but these are all pieces of a very large puzzle. That being said, as well, We also have the fact that in 2003 we had a very similar event. I talked about it on this channel before. If you haven't seen what I'm referring to, please go to the hour and some odd long video where I break down this engineering study that they did on the dam and on these neighborhoods in Lakewood Ranch and all that. I highly suggest, excuse me, I highly suggest that you guys go actually watch that and see what I'm talking about in there, because all that stuff's relevant to this conversation as well. And it all plays in, everything all ties into together. One watershed's going to play off another, off another, off another, off another. And, these maps and stuff that they're using to get all of this data and that, all this stuff we rely on in order to keep us safe and make sure we don't flood, and we're being responsible and holding our water and treating our water so it's clean, so it takes less time to get clean once it goes into the ground. All these things, they have to be accurate. They have to be, because if one's fudging a little too much, one's not enough, sometimes they balance out and sometimes they don't. Two wrongs don't always make a right. And that's what we're seeing. So I understand that's kind of a lot. It's long-winded, and we're kind of rehashing maybe some of the same things that we've talked about before, but it's ultimately vital to make sure that what we are getting is the best possible product for our neighborhoods. There's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of studies out there. There's so many different things. I could not do it by myself. And to everybody that I talk to, I'm not gonna name them because I don't want to shout them out like that. Some of them very sensitive jobs and things, but you know I'm not here to do your job. I'm not here to tell you how to do your job, whatever the case is. I'm not here to stand on anybody's toes. But I do appreciate your professionalism. I do appreciate your insight. I do appreciate your cooperation in these things. Ultimately, we all have to try and move in the same direction to get to a goal. And it's very rough when an agency that you feel like should be there to protect you kind of throws their hands up, and they're like, "Oh, I don't know, man. That's not part of my job description." And kind of says, "Well, you got to fork out your own money to prove that to me." No, that's not my job either. So we're all working in my little circle to try and get towards the same cause, and to get this stuff out there for you guys and advocate and be the voice that's knowledgeable and can adequately represent the intricacy and the ins and outs of this whole complex situation. It's something that it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of knowledge. It takes a lot of verification. And there's absolutely no way that any of us could do it alone. It takes a lot of stepping on people's toes, unfortunately. Some people might get mad at me for saying and doing some of the stuff that I do, but at the end of the day, when it affects your life and your property, you start to matter. It starts to matter, and you start to care, versus the rest of the. I mean, and I hate to say this, but the rest of people, a lot of times, ignorance is bliss, guys. You know, if it doesn't affect you directly, a lot of times it's like, well, I'll just forget about it and wait until it's a problem. By the time it's a problem for you, it's too late. And there's been hundreds of other people that are already drowning. And that's all we're asking for. We're just asking for a little bit of consideration here. help your neighbor out, give them the benefit of the doubt, and try and let them show to you what they know and what they can prove if, they're that kind of person. With this stuff, documentation's everything, and checking up on people and making sure that everything is adequately um, depicted from your argument and everything like that is super, super, super important. And the biggest thing that I can say, if you're fighting a development or you're trying to understand, or if you're trying to understand or you're trying to gain more knowledge, is listen to the people that's out there fighting the fight. Do your own research. You're 110% more knowledgeable on your immediate area than any government official or any person that is there to do a job. Ultimately, you have to live there for however long you decide to live there, and you're the one that has to live or die by your choices. So don't think that any of these organizations are out there to help you. They're not. Point blank, period. They will tell that to your face. That's not my job. I don't have anything to do with that. That's over my head. And they're not going to work very hard to collect the dots and to cross the T's and dot the I's. And they will tell you that that is not their job. They are not going to dig super far through anything, and they are not going to do anything outside their job description to help you out. If they do, it is a high courtesy favor. So at the end of the day, what I want to say is keep a lookout for the information that I'm sharing. I'm learning new stuff every day. Me and my fellow people that we talk and converse with are gathering and learning new information every day. And I'm always open to suggestions. As always, if you have any news tips or anything like that, please hit me up on my email, parishnewsnetwork@gmail.com. Also, another thing that I'd like to say is I should have something coming up here pretty soon that I will post here on YouTube, like a little reaction to it. Give a shout out, whatever the case is, once that's completed. And I have not been able to finish my documentary, as some of the people in my circle know, and some outside kind of know. I was involved in a little bit of an automobile deal. I can't get into the specifics right now until it's settled out. Once everything's settled out, I'll be more than happy to share my story and how much of a horrific experience has been, because it's been horrible. But I can't say anything right now. I have to keep my mouth shut. That's under advisement, and that's that situation has really put a damper on getting the documentary done. That being said, I'm having to shoot and film and edit and everything myself, and trying to find the time for that in between the other hardships of the first situation. It's been very difficult. So it's looking like it's probably going to take me another season or three to get this done and to get this pushed out, and for it to be the quality that I want it to be. This documentary, honestly, I don't want it to be accusatory for legal reasons. I would really, really, really prefer it to be very more make up your own opinion, and be more so where I'm just presenting the evidence. I'm just presenting the story. You guys make your own opinion from there. That's what I'm shooting for. I was going to do it in a little bit different of a light, and I completely scrapped that script. I ran it through a couple different source checkers and things like that. And it's not that it wasn't factual, but it was just borderline accusatory, and there is no evidence for the documentary's sake that any one particular individual or entity has done anything wrong, regarding Tropical Storm Debbie. So, that's a whole nother conversation we'll have to have for another day. But I at least wanted to get out here, let you guys kind of know I haven't been on here in a while. I did post that one thing the other day, which was to share for a couple people that were asking. I ran out of phone storage on my phone. That's been an issue. Plus, I have not been carrying a GoPro for a little while, so that's been another issue. And my SD card went missing somewhere. That's another issue. So everything will work itself out. I appreciate you guys' patience and understanding. If you're interested in talking about this, shoot me an email as well. And, I'll be more than happy to share my wealth of knowledge anywhere here in this process. Other than that, guys, have a good night. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thanks, guys.